On this episode, me and Greg talk about exposure, including the exposure triangle, a new way to think about ISO from our friend Mike James from Australia, and different ways to deal with exposure and compensate and view how the exposure works with our photos.
It's Monday, July 17th, and this is the iPhoneography podcast. Welcome to the show. Dave, how are you?
Not doing good, Greg, and yourself?
Oh, I'm not too bad. For an old guy. Yeah, I'm in the middle of my work schedule where I just finished working 3 days, and tomorrow night I got to go in for 3 nights. So this is what I call the short turnaround, where I turn around. I go from days to nights, and it's just been doing it for so many years. It's just another part of the schedule. But anyway, we're going to start off real quick here with a couple of news items. The first one that I wanted to mention is that the Reflex team has put out a new Facebook group. So if any of you folks that are listening use any of their apps, which is the Reflex Pro camera, Re-Expose or Reheld, or if you use any of their products like lenses or filters, this is a great group to be in. And that's one of the stipulations, is that you either have to use one of the camera apps or some of the products in to make any of the pictures that you post. And but it's a great little community already. It's growing, and there's a lot of familiar faces in there. A lot of people coming from the iPhoneography podcast group, from Shane Moslin's group, from the Explorers of Life group with Rick Salmon. A lot of these people are mingling amongst those three different groups, or all these different groups. So, if you join, you won't be a stranger by any means. So, go check the group out. There'll be a link in the show notes, and you have to answer a couple of questions to get in. But other than that, it's a great environment. So that's my little bit of news. Dave, you were just going to start to tell me something. I said, no, wait. Yep. I want to hear it. I want to hear it live, just like everybody else. So go ahead.
Okay. So, of course, even though we're still a month and a half away, probably just under 2 months away from the new iPhones, they're in production now. We know they're in production now because you can't sell tens of millions of phones without producing them far ahead.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
So there will be the 15s will be like the 14s, where there's going to be the regular 15, the 15 Max, the 15 Pro, and the 15 Pro Max. So 4 phones just like we currently have. Pretty solid. They're going to have USB-C. So
I think that's a given. Yeah.
So new cords or dongles for everybody.
Yeah, really.
The only good thing
millions is and millions of dollars for Apple.
Well, no, not necessarily though.
Well, no. I mean, there will be other
because USB-C
third-party options, I think. But
that's the thing. It'll just be a USB-C to USB-C. Cord.
Yeah.
So you can get them anywhere for pretty cheap.
I wonder though, Dave, just on that note, they say with the lightning cords, you're much safer to use the ones from Apple, or at least that are made for Apple.
Well, yes.
Or made for iPhones.
That's a little different. That's a little different because that is Apple going through a certification process.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you go and if you go online and get a $1.50 cord instead of paying $10, there's hardware and circuitry inside the lightning cord itself.
Right.
So almost every time when you see phones catch on fire that are plugged in, they're the cheapy cords.
Right. Yeah. So would the same not apply then though with the USB-C cords?
Well,
like is there not that?
There is, however, you'll be able to find better quality USB-C non-Apple than you can Lightning. That's not Apple.
Okay.
Especially since the actual plug itself is just a plug.
But it does data transfer too, though, right?
Right, but it's not an Apple plug.
Oh, right. Yes. Okay. You got me there.
So now, if you want to make a lightning plug, you either have to get Apple's, come down and give you its blessing, or you need to take a an Apple Bless cord, reverse engineer it so you get the dimensions right and you get this and you get the circuitry on
Okay.
the
Yeah.
inside right.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. USB-C is a global standard, I
it's a
guess. Yeah.
global
So that
standard
there's a
that
big difference. Okay.
everyone's
Yeah.
been using, including USB-C for the iPad Pros.
Yeah.
They've been using them for a couple of years. So,
Yeah.
yes, but you may need a new cord, but it'll be cheaper for the same quality.
Right. Okay. All
You
right.
know,
I didn't mean to go on that
and it should be
tangent, but
quick.
I
No,
just
and it
wanted
should be
to get my
quicker
head
too.
wrapped around that.
Right.
So anyway, so
Yeah.
USB-C.
The other thing they're looking to have similar to with the watch, where you have like an active button on the side.
Okay. Yeah.
So instead of the mute physical switch on the side, it'll just be an activity button that you can map.
Oh,
So
really?
yes, similar to with the
That's
Apple
interesting.
Watch, you can map like with the Watch Ultra.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
have the big button on the side that you can map for different things.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll be able to do that. But it's going to
Well,
be
that's
solid
cool.
state. It'll be solid state. It won't
Yeah.
be a button that actually pushes in.
All right. Okay.
And apparently they wanted to do that with the volume. Something happened where they couldn't get it down good enough for them. So the volume buttons will still be the physical clicky buttons that we have
Right.
now.
Okay.
But that to me, I want to say is minor, but there's going to be different colors too. That
Yeah.
at least they're going to be bright. It looks like we may have bright colors, something other than muted colors for the Pro,
Oh, really?
which I'm happy about. But again, heavy rumor on that, and that's kind of hardest to do. The heavy rumor is there will be a periscope lens from multiple sites.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, it's only going to go up to 6x.
Yeah, that sucks.
Yeah. Now, it could be that Apple has seen people with the 10x Samsung.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the first thing anyone does is max it out to 10.
Oh, sure.
And it's because you're doing a 10x and you're still using a very small distance with the periscope. It's hard to keep it sharp. You know what I mean? There's still, if you do the 10, it looks better than the digital zoom.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
if you take a Samsung 10x and compare it to a cheapy handheld 10x, I'm guessing the cheapy handheld 10x will be a better shot than a Samsung 10x, because when you zoom, the more you zoom, and this is kind of leading into nice discussion, the more you zoom, the less light you bring in.
Yes, that's
And
right.
if your lens is literally the head of a pencil, eraser,
Yeah.
you're not letting in a lot of light. And the more you zoom, the less light you're bringing in. So I'm assuming they went to Sony, who does all the camera modules. They went to the lens makers. They said, okay, we want to have bright. We want to be sharp at maximum optical zoom.
Mm-hmm.
We want to have little shaking also for video.
Right.
We want people to be able to take video without it being a little shaky wobbly, or without having to use software stabilization or hardware stabilization where it makes it look maybe a little muddled.
Yeah.
It'll keep it steady, but you're not going to, it's like, so what's the best we could do for making, 200 million phones in the next year?
Yeah.
And they may have said, well, we can do 6x comfortable.
Well, to your
at this
point
cost.
about 10x,
Yeah.
Huawei, the P40, I think it is. There's a chap, you've probably seen him in Shane's group, at least if not other groups. His name is Patrica from Romania, and he has a Huawei P40 Pro, I think it is, and the zoom on that thing, like the clarity of the images at 10x is just unbelievable. It's just amazing what he's producing with that thing. And but 6x is just disappointing.
I know. And I'm a little disappointed because there are other companies out there doing 10.
Yeah.
And this may be, I really doubt that this is a fake out, you know, that Apple will come on stage and say, we have 12x optical zoom,
Yeah, that's
you
highly
know.
unlikely. You know, Apple, they take baby steps.
Yeah, exactly. So, and the thing is that there is, in reality, in different sizes, but in reality, there's two phones that Apple comes out with every year,
Hmm.
the non-pro and the pro.
Yeah.
That's it. Where, Huawei, Samsung, they come out with a plethora of models that
Yeah.
when they even catch on fire, hello,
Yeah.
Samsung note, it doesn't kill the company.
Yeah.
But if the iPhone 15 exploded and they said, yeah, it's a design flaw in the phone,
Yeah, that
Apple's
wouldn't be
done
good.
for. But I'm saying
Yeah.
they couldn't say, well, we have these 13 other models that you can choose from.
Hmm.
Literally, Apple would have to say, this is our only phone.
Yeah. Use at your own risk.
You're holding
Yeah.
it wrong,
So
But
was there any other things that
uh,
you heard about?
no, those were at least for me the two biggest ones.
Okay.
I do want to hold off on color because color is so subjective.
Yeah.
You
I mean,
know,
last year a lot of people speculated that it would be purple, and I was hoping for
yeah,
like instead of the purple, I was hoping for like a midnight blue or something, like a real
yeah.
dark blue, because they went, Pacific blue with the 12 Pro. Um, I forget what the blue is on yours, the 13 Pro, but it's a lighter blue.
It's a light blue. It's a Sierra blue, so it's almost like
Sierra, that's it. Yeah,
yeah.
Sierra
It's
blue.
like a steel gray blue.
Yeah. So I had real high hopes for like a really dark, like, that
Mm,
starlight color they put on the MacBooks and stuff.
yeah.
I was hoping for that for the iPhone 14 Pro Max, but it came out purple, which is fine. I mean, my wife has a purple iPhone 12, and so then I went and got the purple Pro Max. So, why not, right? And I do like the color, but anyway.
Yeah. And
Um,
actually it's saying here, uh nope, actually it's saying for the non-pro. The non-pro, unfortunately, will be midnight, starlight, so black and gray,
mhm.
midnight starlight,
Oh yeah.
green, yellow, but a bright yellow, pink, and product red. And I
Hmm.
really wish it would go to the pros because
Yeah, it would be nice.
okay, yes, I do. I want the pro because I want the zoom lens. I want the better camera, but I also would like some color with that.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
So
on the plus side though, Dave,
yeah,
neither one of us is going to be upgrading this year. At least
that is true. No,
I'm 99.9% sure I'm not going to be.
not unless I hit the lottery. No,
Exactly. Yeah. And if I hit the lottery, I'll buy you one.
there we go.
But anyway, all right. So that's a couple of news items that we thought we'd just throw out there at the last minute. And so now we're going to get on to our continuing series on improving your photography with your iPhone. And this week is it's all about understanding exposure. And I think, like last week we talked about what the heck? Oh, natural light. So I
Right.
mean that was kind of that could translate over to traditional photography, but a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about tonight is kind of iPhone centric. So, but I think again, a lot of it still can translate into the other stuff. But
Mm-hmm.
so understanding exposure and again recap. This is all stuff that was kind of dug up from Chat GPT. So what Chat GPT said about understanding exposure is understanding exposure in iPhone photography is crucial for capturing well-exposed and balanced images. Exposure refers to the amount of light that reaches the camera sensor and determines the brightness or darkness of your photos. Here are some key concepts to help you grasp exposure in photography, in iPhone photography. So the first part, now the first the first item is the exposure triangle, and it's broken down into three things. So what it says about that is the exposure triangle consists of three main components: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. These elements work together to control the amount of light entering the camera and affect the overall exposure of the image. So I'll cover aperture, and then Dave's going to cover shutter speed, and then we're going to kind of go back and forth throughout this whole thing tonight. So aperture, what it says here is on iPhones, the aperture is fixed, so you don't have to so you don't have direct control over it. However, it's essential to understand that the iPhone's main camera has a wider aperture or lower f number, which works. Actually, you know what? This is I kind of doctored this up a little bit because it was a little vague in its description here. So some of this is ChatGPT, some of this is mine.
Yeah.
So, however, it's essential to understand that the iPhone's main camera has a wider aperture or a lower f number, which works better in low light situations by allowing more light to reach the sensor. The ultrawide has a slightly smaller aperture, and the telephoto typically has the smallest aperture. And I put typically there because I was looking back at the camera specs of the iPhones 12, 13, and 14 Pro models. And the aperture on the telephoto kind of changes from one year to the next, and it actually got better, and then it got worse again, or something like that. But anyway, so on your screen, folks, you're going to see a picture, and there's three. I'm going to talk about three here, but I'm only going to show one because it's basically the same picture. The only difference is the first one, the one you're going to look at right now, was taken with my iPhone 12 Pro Max a couple of years ago. And when I dug these out, I wanted to find three pictures I took, one with each camera of the same thing. And so, and the reason I did this is because each camera has a different aperture. And I mean, I know that the aperture in relation to the lens and sensor and all that stuff, I mean, they're going to work a little bit differently to each other. But I just kind of wanted to illustrate the differences in the apertures in these cameras. So the ultra wide, which is the picture that's on the screen, it's got an aperture in the 12 Pro Max of f2.4. And then this image was taken at ISO 25, and the shutter speed was 1/2398, because it was kind of a bright day. So the aperture is not very big on that lens. In fact, it's the smallest aperture on that phone out of the three cameras. The wide has an aperture of 1.6, which is a lot more wide open. Like it's a lot more open to let more light in. And the camera took a shot, this same shot at ISO 32, but the shutter speed was a whopping 1/12,048. So because it's letting more light in, it didn't need as slow of a shutter speed to create the image. So it was basically, it looks like the same exposure. You know what? I'm going to put it on the screen anyway. So if you look at your screen now, you'll see it. It's basically the same as the other one, and but the shutter speed was like 4 times as fast or 3 times as fast or whatever. Like it was considerably faster, but it's because the light's coming in faster, if that makes any sense. And then the telephoto, which I'll put on the screen now, it had in the 12 Pro Max an aperture of f2.2. So it's slightly smaller than the ultra wide, and still not as big as, or no, slightly bigger than the ultra wide. Sorry,
Yeah.
but not as big as the wide. So this one was ISO 20, and the shutter speed was kind of in between those other two at 1/5236. So, I mean, what does all this mean? Well, basically what it means is because the shutter, the aperture is fixed on these cameras. You cannot change the aperture. Um, the camera will behave differently from one to the other because of that aperture. It's either going to let in a little bit of light or it's going to let in a lot more light. The less light it lets in, it's going to take a little bit longer to make that exposure look the same as the other ones. Mm-hmm. So, the wide being 1.6, it's a considerably larger opening in the lens. And because of that, it doesn't take nearly as long to make the exposure. So the shutter speed is much faster. So that's about the best way I can explain aperture on the iPhone. Because it's fixed, there's literally nothing you can do with the aperture itself. The only controls you have is with ISO or shutter speed. And when it's in automatic, the iPhone essentially tries to take the lowest ISO with the highest shutter speed combination it needs to create the perfect exposure. And that's about all I got about that. Yeah. Any thoughts on aperture, Dave?
Well, this is one part where physics sticks its head in.
Exactly. Yep.
And one reason why the aperture got worse when going from the 12 to 13 is because the zoom changed. The zoom went from 2.5 to 3.
Yes,
and the longer zoom meant that the aperture let in less light.
Yeah.
And that's physics.
See, that's why I'm glad I got Dave here, because I never think of that part of it. Yep. And he's exactly right. It's physics. I mean, yeah. So
there's really
me. So yeah, it's and you can't beat physics. We know that, right?
No. You can throw computation at it and try to the one thing you could do, and we've seen other phones with this, you have just a big old massive lens on the back of it. I forget who put that out. Was it oh, this was years ago. Someone made like a lens that was like an inch across. It was like one big giant eyeball looking lens in the back of the camera. And they did it as a photographer's camera, but that's all it had going for it. Was large, but there was so much they couldn't do because you were stuck with it. It was a gimmick. Right. But that's why a lot of times if you ever see people with ultra zoom lenses, like 600 millimeters, the type you need a support for because it's so heavy, those lenses they're like as big as people's heads.
Yeah, they're massive.
Mammoth. Okay. The reason why they're massive is because when you get that much of a zoom, you need a big lens to let in enough light. And
yeah. Oh yeah.
We hear people complaining about the lens bump. Why can't you get, well, okay, you can, certain things are physics. If you make the battery thicker, you have thermal issues. So you can only make it so thick for thermal issues, because these are things that are going to be used outside in the heat, in the sun, in cases. So they have to worry about cases and thermal this and everything else going on. So there's all these back and forth, and they have to, and this is everybody. This isn't just Apple. This is everyone. So,
yeah,
as much as it would be great to say, well, fix it in software. Well,
yeah,
you still need. That's why you can do more things in RAW than JPEG, because RAW has more data, but you're still kind of limited because the sensor size is still small. When they say this is our largest sensor size, well, it's still teeny tiny. It's still amazing what image you can get out of a teeny tiny sensor and lens. And, like Apple says, oh, our main lens, our wide main lens, whatever they want to call it, has 7 different parts to it. And you think about how thick that is to have 7 individual parts. And, they have also optical stabilization, where there's a little motor that shakes it and alternates to shaking the camera on something.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's you know,
It's trying to work around physics limitations. That's it.
yeah,
I hate to say it. I want, if you want to put it this way, engineering is getting around the limitation that physics gives us.
yeah, that's right. Yeah. And it's amazing how they can do it too.
Oh, it is. It is. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, next on the list is shutter speed. So,
Yep.
Dave, take that one away.
Yep. And shutter speed determines how long you actually expose it. A faster shutter speed now does it's in fractions. So since it is a fraction, the bigger the number on the bottom, the smaller the overall number. So the quicker the shutter, you have less light. The slower shutter speed you may want, but as you're capturing more light, you're also introducing things that could be like that could happen with shake. And so if you're really in a dark area and you're trying to do it by just adjusting the shutter speed, and you're saying, well, I'm going to do a shutter speed, and Apple, I think, limits it to, is it 1 second for
One
max or
second.
even less? 1 second.
1 second.
Because it overheats. Again, overheating. So if you do an even longer app or other apps or reflex, which allows you to do it, what they're doing is they're taking multiple shots and then stacking those shots, averaging those shots to give you one final shot at the end. They're not really doing a 9 second exposure.
Right. And I
So,
think it's appropriate to mention, and I think I mentioned this on an episode not too long ago, that the shutter on the iPhone isn't, you know, the blades that are opening and closing that you would see on a traditional camera lens. It's an electronic shutter where it turns the screen on and off, or not the screen. It turns the sensor on and off, or it activates and deactivates it. That's basically how the shutter works on the iPhone, and it scans. You could still get those anomalies that you see
so
in
yeah, you can
photography if
you still
something's
get the
moving.
shutter. Yeah.
Yeah, it's because it's scanning from the top to the bottom or whatever. And anyway, but so it's an electronic shutter. It doesn't work the way you might think it did. And you know what? I didn't know this until not too long ago. It was somebody in one of their Facebook groups that brought my attention to it. So, that's something to remember, and that's probably why the iPhone is limited to 1 second, because if that sensor stays activated for too long, then that's what's going to overheat it. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there. So carry on.
Yeah. And I mean, this is why it's good to have an idea about what's behind the scenes a little bit, because if you don't, realize why there are limitations like they are, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Now, the built-in camera, you can't do anything with shutter speed. You're stuck. You can do third-party apps, like Reflex. You can do other Camera Plus, Halide. You can select a shutter speed there. So, and the nice thing is with those apps, as you're adjusting the shutter speed, you can see what the image will look like. So there's less guessing. So you can say, "Oh, I want to, increase my shutter speed." You can see if it's getting brighter, or you're like, "I want to decrease my shutter speed to let in a little bit less light," and get a different feel for the image before you take it versus post processing.
Yeah. And when it comes to that, decreasing and increasing the bright, it also plays on, like you mentioned earlier, something about blurring, right? If the shutter speed is slow, where the number is, oops, I just knocked my microphone. If the shutter speed has a higher number, not a higher number, a lower number on the bottom of the fraction, like say 1/30th, compared to 1/500th of a second, a couple of things come into play here. 1/30th of a second, you could end up with, if the subject is something that's moving really fast, if there's not enough light, it could blur it. At 1/1000th of a second, if that same subject is moving really fast, you might be able to freeze the subject, but it may also look darker because you're only got the shutter's only active for a much shorter period of time. So you actually need much more light for it to show up normally. It's really something that, this whole subject of exposure. I could jump from one thing to the next here and still try to make my point. Sometimes it's better to use a manual camera app, and I'm going to get to that later, because you can control the shutter better. Because with the the Apple camera app, all you've got is that slider that goes up and down to adjust the exposure. It's not showing you what happens to the exposure values when you do that. It's just, the 90-90 rule kicks in. They're pleasing 90% of the people 90% of the time. But if you want to have more control over it, you've got to use a manual app so you can actually see the value, see what it does, and go from there. So I kind of feel like I'm hijacking your spot here, Dave, about shutter speed, but it's
everything when we're talking about exposure triangle, it all overlaps each other.
Exactly. Yes.
Because it's not, you can't think about it's really hard to think of it independently, because aperture affects shutter speed, ISO will affect shutter speed. It's really hard to say, well, I'm just going to change the shutter speed, because changing the shutter speed, you need to adjust the ISO.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of, and generally you're not thinking in your mind, the shutter speed, or at least I wouldn't. The shutter speed should be blah, 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 blah. You want an image to look a certain way. And getting that image means that your shutter speed is this and your ISO is this, in order to prevent a lot of grain, unless you want a lot of grain.
Yeah,
that's an artistic look. If you're going for a high S, kind of going into ISO a little bit, but if you're going for a real grainy look for a picture, you're going for a higher ISO. But that means you're more sensitive to the light, which means you need a slower shutter speed, otherwise you'll blow out your image.
Yes, exactly.
So it's all, this is one thing, this is why it's like the exposure triangle. It's all interrelated.
Yeah.
And something that you generally don't have to think about.
Yeah. With the iPhone, because the aperture is fixed, it is sort of out of the equation, but only to the extent where, because you only have two other things you can play with, it's like a balance of a scale where you can balance it. The perfect exposure is where the scales are exactly the same.
Yeah.
But if you start weighing one heavier than the other, then your exposure is going to change. Your image is going to have a different look to it. And, I was trying to think of a good analogy, and that's about the best I could come up with. That it's like a scale. You got perfect exposure; the scales are right the same. I can't think of anything else for shutter speed other than I can go into a ton of examples. You had some pictures there, Dave. Are those anything to do with shutter speed, or are they for other parts here?
You know what? Let me get these up on the screen here. These are more for others, to be honest.
Okay.
Yeah, those are more for when we're talking about either exposure compensation or dealing with the auto HDR and smart HDR.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll jump to ISO then. And ChatGPT said ISO refers to the sensitivity of the camera sensor to light. A lower ISO, for example, ISO 100, produces less noise but requires more light. There's that scale we're getting into. A higher ISO, example ISO 800 or above, makes the sensor more sensitive to light but can introduce more digital noise. It's generally recommended to use the lowest ISO possible for the desired exposure. This is where this thing gets completely blown apart by our good friend from Australia, Mike James. Now, we had hoped to have Mike on the show tonight, but he's traveling today, and and couldn't make it. But so I told Mike, I said, look, I'm going to use this information like crazy to illustrate our point here. And he said, yeah, that's fine. Go ahead. So there's links in the show notes to a YouTube video where Mike talks about this, and to a blog post if you want to read it. And when I say this is going to get blown out of the water, out of proportion or whatever, what Mike says, and he's right, is ISO is not what everyone thinks. So back in the film days, it used to be sensitivity to light. The higher the ISO number, the more sensitive it was to the light. In digital photography, it's not sensor sensitivity. These sensors are not made from light-sensitive silver halide crystals like film was. These sensors are pixels made of electrons, and there's photons or whatever. But I mean, they're not sensitive in the same way that film was. The term ISO transferred to digital photography, and people naturally assumed it meant sensor sensitivity. I was one of them. I was saying to Dave that I just a couple of months ago, I saw someone in one of the Facebook groups brought this to my attention about how the shutter worked with the turning the sensor on and off. And I always thought the shutter was these blades that open and close. Well, I learned something new then, and I learned something new when I heard about this from Mike. And it's completely not what everybody thought. But anyway, the function of ISO in digital is actually it's applied gain, which is it's the increase or decrease of the image's brightness after the capture. So when the iPhone takes a picture, it's capturing the image at the lowest ISO that camera is capable of doing. And actually, I think each of the cameras may have a different low ISO value. But what happens is when the images are recorded, let's just say, okay, I'm going to use examples here. These are not accurate numbers, but let's just say you take a photo at ISO 100, and that's what the lowest ISO the camera is capable of doing. So it's going to take the image and make it, basically at the benchmark. That's what it's capable of doing. Now, if you set the ISO to 200, the camera's going to snap the shot at 100, but it's going to apply a gain of another 100 in ISO, and it's going to brighten the image by a stop. And it does this basically instantly. I mean, these things, they make billions of computations per second or whatever it is, right? Or per image. And so that's what it's doing, is it's brightening the image by, whatever factor it works out to according to the ISO you choose. So instead of grain, like you got in film, the increase of the gain. So when it does all this brightening, like say if you set your ISO really high, what it's doing is it's degrading the details, sharpness, and dynamic range of the image. And I kind of compare that to pizza dough before you bake it. If you got enough pizza dough for a 6-inch pizza, but you want to stretch that out to make a 12-inch pizza, what's going to happen? You're going to get holes in the pizza, right?
Yep.
In the dough.
Yep.
That's what I liken noise to be, digital noise, because you're stretching the capabilities of the sensor, and by doing that, you're losing detail, sharpness, and dynamic range in the image, and something's got to give.
Yeah.
So that's what's going to happen. So the bottom line is that ISO adds brightness, and you can't always use the lowest ISO because the lighting conditions may call for, a faster or slower shutter speed, depending on what you're taking a photo of. So that's a really good explanation by Mike, and I thank you, Mike, for that, and I'm glad we were able to use some of that information And again, links in the show notes to his video and his blog post.
Now, before we move on, I want to make sure everyone knows we're referring to pretty much single images, or a single image as an iPhone can take.
Yes.
When we get to night mode, all this gets thrown out the window.
Yeah, it sure does.
And that's true with Android, with Samsung night mode, with Pixel night mode, iPhone. Anytime you get to where I'm going to set my phone down for 30 seconds and get the Milky Way galaxy core in my shot, that's another level of computational photography, where they're taking tons of shots, comparing, overlapping, making sure you don't have streaks because the star moved over 30 seconds. That's completely different. I don't want anyone to think, well, night mode breaks the rules because it's not a single photo.
Right. That is absolutely correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we won't even get into, the meat potatoes of night mode. That's go check out Shane Mostyn's channel for night stuff. He's the master of that.
Yeah, agreed.
Hang on, I gotta let the dog out.
Okay.
There you go, babe. So
we finally answered that question.
Which one?
Who let the dog out?
Oh, apparently it was me.
It was you all along, Greg.
Oh, that's good stuff. So I mean, with ISO, and we won't even get into the term ISO because it's that it comes from a Greek word. It's all in Mike's blog post about where ISO the term comes from. So
I thought it came from somewhere different. I thought it was ISO as in ISO.
Yeah, like the International Standards Organization. No, it's
and I thought it because they said 200 because ISO standard 200 film is this, 400 was this, 800 was this, 1600 was this.
No, it's
so it's actually a Greek term, just that it happens to share.
Okay, so what the heck?
Time to do some searching.
I'll get into it. It's right here. Okay. So on Mike's blog, it says ISO, and I say ISO because it could be ISO, could be ISO, but ISO for short. It's not an acronym. Most professional photographers believe that ISO is an acronym for the International Standards Organization. Here's the quote from the International Organization for Standardization website. And that's where it comes from, the International Organization for Standardization, because International Organization for Standardization would have different acronyms in different languages, like IOS in English, ION in French, for organization, blah, 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 normalization, and whatever, however the French is pronounced. Our founders decided to give it the short form ISO. ISO is derived from the Greek word isos, ISOS, meaning equal. So whatever country, whatever the language, we're always ISO. And so ISOS, meaning equal, that's basically the standard, right? That's where the standard comes from. So like I mentioned earlier, the benchmark. So that's the story behind ISO or ISO. I just call it ISO because it's basically short for ISOs.
Now here's what's crazy. I'm seeing another website. It says camera ISO does not refer to the organization. Mm-hmm. There was the ASA, which was the American standard, and the DIN, which were the German standard. They were converted into an ISO standard in 1974. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's basically the same idea.
Yeah.
The International Organization for Standardization wanted something that was going to sound the same in all languages, right? Yeah.
Well, I know that I just know that different ISO specs all start with ISO.
Yeah.
That's their common term, whether it's sold, no matter where it's sold. Like
Right.
ISO 9100 is their quality specification.
Oh yes. Yeah, that's the International
Right.
Standardization Organization or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. And I was actually trained by them to be an auditor at work.
Oh, okay.
I could audit our processes and
Hmm.
procedures and things like that. That was always cool. That was always a fun
Oh,
thing to
yeah.
do. Learn more about the company that way. But anyway, so yeah, so that's ISO or ISO, and basically the best way to explain it is okay. So for this analogy, I like to use a frying pan, and the frying pan is the digital sensor. Now think of this: when you put your finger on a frying pan, the frying pan is like barely even warm. Like it's not even warm. It's so low temperature. You could put your finger on it for a long time.
Mm.
So if you've got ISO 25, you could put your finger on there, and it might take and these numbers are totally whack, but I mean, just for illustration purposes
Right.
here, you could put your finger on there for 5 seconds before you feel any heat, right?
Hmm.
So that's like low ISO. Now you crank that frying pan onto high heat, and to the point where you could put a tablespoon of butter on it and it would melt almost instantly. Now you
Hmm.
try touching that with your finger, like you're going, ow, and your
Yeah.
finger is on there and off real quick. That is like putting your ISO at 6400, and the picture gets taken in an instant. So it's it's kind of like as if it was sensitive to light, which we just described that it's not light sensitivity, but it's just a brightness factor. But if you kind of use that analogy, that is kind of like as if it was sensitive to light, um, you'll get to understand that the higher the ISO, the shorter the frame, or the shorter the faster the shutter speed needs to be.
Hmm.
The lower the ISO, the little longer the shutter speed can be in order to get the same thing.
Right.
So that's about the best way I can explain
Hmm.
ISO.
Yep.
So now we get to look at a couple of more pictures from Dave when he
Yep.
talks about exposure compensation.
Yep. So, this is the iPhone's native camera app. Does do an exposure compensation. Basically, you tap on the screen to set the focus, and you can leave your finger there. You can either swipe up or down to manually adjust it that way. Other apps have different things where you can tap with two fingers. One will do the focus, and the other one will. So you could focus on a close-up image on your left, but you want to expose for something on the right-hand side. So
Mm-hmm.
you can manually do a compensation, not let it do automatically. So if there are certain, like I said, if there's something that you want to focus on that's in your left, but you want to deal with the compensation in a different part of the screen, you can do that. Or if you're using the built-in app, you're like, okay, that's my subject there, but my subject's kind of dark. So I'm going to, instead of letting the auto HDR and smart HDR do its thing, I'm going to manually increase it. Now, one thing to remember is when you increase or decrease, you're doing that for the entire image.
Yes.
So you're not doing it only for the subject. So if your subject is dark and let's say backlit or kind of very poorly lit, and the parts that are at the time nicely lit, they may be overexposed.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that doesn't stop you from exposing your subject correctly and then adjusting the non-subject part down later on, because you want to make sure you do your subject, what you're most concerned about, in the right light, and the rest of it you can take care of later on.
Yeah. So this image of the things that are on your table, is
Yep.
that what you
My
wanted
little
to?
tchotchkes. Yeah, my little
Yeah.
tchotchkes at work.
So
So,
one of these images is brighter than the other. So let's
right,
start with the darker
right.
one.
Now, notice that I took this picture in the morning, and this the window here off on the left faces east. So there's a little bit of leftover morning sun coming in, which means that not only do I have the overhead fluorescent light, that's where everything has that yellow tinge to it. I have backlit light off on my left. So
Hmm.
when I just let the camera do its automatic adjustment, it adjusted for the whole image. Also, because I just don't have a single subject here, I have multiple subjects. That it made the bobbleheads are kind of dark. The coal figurines are really, really dark because they're coal figurines.
Hmm.
And it just kind of makes it hard to see the subject. In the second image, um, I did adjust where I went to the darkest part of the image and adjusted that up.
Okay.
I also did some post processing on here too. So this isn't just, I would say, this isn't just dealing with the exposure compensation. Because if I would have only did that, you notice that the window on the back would have been overblown tremendously.
Hmm.
Because
Yeah.
that's a because it basically there is a roof over there. It'd be nice if they would have made it into a deck you can stand on, but it's just a roof, but it's a white roof.
Right.
So it reflects a lot. And my blind there is white. So even though I have it pulled, and the way the blind is, it isn't a solid blind, it's a blind with like holes in it.
Yeah. Perforated. Yeah.
It's perforated, so and it's white. And it's a mm, a light yellow wall. So tons of light. But the problem is I want to have, like I say, I have on my desk, I have two figurines. One's Willie Stargell, one Rennie Stennett, uh, pirates from the 60s and 70s, both African American gentlemen. So their figurines, especially in shadow, hard to pick up.
Yeah.
In the back, those are coal figurines which are carved that I got when I
Oh,
went to
okay.
school down WVU. So they're real coal, which of course coal is dark.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
It's basically coal that was coated so it doesn't rub off on your hand, but it's still coal. So you lose any detail at all. Same thing with the hockey pucks. So to get that, if you did no other adjustment, the rest of the image would kind of be blown out.
Yeah.
This is also where the smart HDR can only do so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
The first image was letting the camera do its thing, and it's not horrible. It's not
Yeah.
overly contrasty, but it's still you lose a lot of detail.
Yeah.
So this is where you have to go in and do the compensation, override the manual process there.
Yeah. 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 So, I mean, the second one definitely does show more detail in the shadows. So by, increasing the exposure compensation, it
Mm-hmm.
definitely makes for a better picture. Like you said, with the bobbleheads, you can actually see the facial features and stuff like that better. And
Yeah,
and as far as the window light goes, that to me is not as important in the photo as the rest of
exactly,
these little pieces, right? So that's
exactly.
what I want to see.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you're, like you say, in the native camera app, you can slide the slider up and down to adjust that. But there's also an EV slider that can pop up with the actual numbers
Mm-hmm.
on it, where you hit the little arrow at the top center of the viewfinder, and then pick the plus minus button, I think it is, and it shows a little
Mm-hmm.
scale there where you could slide it back and forth, and that gives you some pretty good control over the exposure compensation. But it does not show shutter speeds and ISO and things like that. So you don't know it down to the meat and potatoes what it's actually doing, but you can use that to get the desired result. So that's a pretty good
Mm-hmm.
comparison right there.
Now, one thing that's also kind of nice for using the EV features as the built-in,
Mm-hmm.
On the top, it tells you what you're doing in terms of a plus minus. So as you're adjusting your EV, on top, it leaves that up there, so you can see that it is adjusted, both
Oh
in
yeah.
graphical and and the number showing the adjustment.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's and it lets you know, basically it lets you know that you've made that adjustment so that if you go to take another image of something else, you can
Mm-hmm.
see, oh, I've adjusted that. Maybe I should put that
Yeah,
back or whatever. Yeah.
and you can just click on it up there, and that'll bring up the EV exposure too.
Yeah.
If you make an adjustment to make another additional adjustment.
Oh yeah. Okay. So yeah, exposure compensation, it's really handy. It's really handy when you know you got your picture framed up and you're not quite happy with it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh and you want to just make that little adjustment to make it more to your liking, whether it's brighter or darker. And it's a great tool. Just don't forget that you've done it in case you go to take a picture of something else
Mm-hmm.
and you don't want to mess it up. So okay, so next is histogram. This is one of my favorite tools to use. And this is also where ChatGPT isn't quite as good as it thinks it is. And you'll find out why I say that in a second here. So what it says is the histogram is a graphical representation of the distribution of tones in an image. It helps you to evaluate the exposure by showing the distribution of shadows, midtones, and highlights. And this is where ChatGPT gets it wrong. In the iPhone's native camera app, you can access the histogram by swiping up at the screen while in the camera mode. Aim for a well-balanced histogram that doesn't have too many pixels pushed against the edges. Well, that part is right, yes, but the Apple camera app does not have a histogram.
Right.
And I kind of wish it did, because I think it would be really helpful to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Especially, even if it has to be something like you said, have it as the push up part there where you can do the different options there.
Yeah. Have it so that you can show it and hide it and whatever, right? So basically, you have to use a third-party camera app in order to get a histogram.
Yeah.
So, Camera Plus, Reflex, Halide, Pro Camera, all these, just about every third-party camera app I've ever experienced has a histogram. So what I like about Reflex, and again, this goes into other apps too, but because I'm a Reflex guy, I know what it does and I'm familiar with it. But an app like Reflex has two options for the histogram. So you can the histogram can either show just the brightness of the image, and it's just basically like a white graph, or you can have it so that it displays all three channels, the red, green, and blue channels of the image. And this is really handy with something like if you're taking a picture of a red flower, like a nice bright red rose. I'm going to put screenshots. Oh, excuse me. I didn't get them in our shared pictures here, Dave, but I'll be putting screenshots of a red rose with the histogram. And the reason I want to show the red is because reds are so easy to blow out in an image. And, they may not look like they're blown out, but they are, because if the histogram goes too far to the right, where it actually hits the flat side of the area of the histogram, when it's going over to the right like that, it's overexposing. And in the 3-channel histogram, if the reds are always very easy to do that with. So what that means is that when you go to, edit your image or post-process your image, if it's overexposed like that, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to get that information back. And the same goes with any image, really. It doesn't necessarily have to be something red, but I just want to illustrate this for the 3-channel part, because the red is the easiest one to overexpose, I think.
Mm.
And so
Which
anyway,
is an issue. Yeah.
yeah, and um, so when you're taking a picture of a red flower like that, I'm going to use the red flower as a generic example here. You want what you want to do is we're going to go back to our exposure compensation discussion, and you want to dial down the exposure compensation. And while you're doing that, look at the histogram and until that red goes down on the bottom part along with the rest of the stuff. It could be to the right side. That's fine, as long as it doesn't climb the wall on the right. And then you know that you're going to be all right with your red exposure. You're not going to lose any detail. It's not going to be, if you try to fix it in post, it's not going to be still that same overblown red. Um, so, and the same goes with underexposing. But the difference with these phone sensors is that you can underexpose until the cows come home. It's almost always going to be able to be recovered in post. And this is in my experience of shooting with the histogram and that. But if you overexpose, it's almost impossible to get that back. So, and the same goes with the brightness histogram, just that white histogram. If it's to the right and climbs the wall a bit, it's overexposed. You might not get that back. But the other thing you could do with a lot of these camera apps is they have a feature called zebra stripes. And these are so cool because you can use those. If you're overexposing, you'll see these zebra stripes on some of the bright areas of the image. Bring your exposure compensation down, or you can adjust your shutter speed or AISO, whatever you want, until those disappear, and then you can take the shot.
Right. And that's
but
a
again,
nice little touch. That's a nice little touch.
Yeah, it's a really good feature. And the other thing is the zebra stripes will also indicate where your shadows are blackened out. But like I said, it's much easier to get the detail back in the shadows than it is in blown out highlights. So basically the histogram is a representation of the brightness of the image, and you don't want to go all the way to the right to the point where it cuts it off. A lot of times the iPhone will keep that histogram within the two ranges because the dynamic range is really, really good on these phones. And that, and to adjust that histogram, there's three ways you can do it. Like I said, you can do the exposure compensation, or you can do just ISO, or you can do just shutter speed. So, I mean, play around with them and see what the histogram does when you look at the image on the screen, the preview of the shot. You don't even have to take the shot. You can just play around with it and see what it does. But it's also a good idea to take the shot so that you can go back to it later and refer to the look at the EXIF data, like the shutter speed, ISO, and stuff like that, and see what it does when the histogram is in certain areas.
So I would say that if you're editing in an app like a Lightroom mobile that has a histogram, that's a way to play around with it too. That way you can see, bring it up and say, okay, I'm doing this. Oh, that's what that histogram. Okay, that's what that histogram looked like. Oh, that's what that does.
Yeah, because if the histogram that shows up in Lightroom Mobile or whatever editing app you're using, as long as it has the histogram, it will be the same as it was in the camera when you took the shot, or bloody well should be anyway. So yeah, that's another great way to, see what it does. Like Dave said, play around with the adjustment sliders and see how the image changes in relation to how the histogram changes. And great tool to use.
Yeah.
So next we've got HDR.
Right. And I'm just going to call it HDR instead of auto HDR, smart HDR, because smart HDR is a marketing term. So the idea behind HDR, and honestly, the first time I remember...
Well, read the thing there.
Yep. The iPhone's HDR see here, help capture a wider range of light and shadow details in high contrast scenes. These features automatically blend multiple exposures to produce a well-exposed image. It's recommended to keep these features enabled for most situations, as they often enhance the dynamic range of your photos.
So HDR stands for?
high dynamic range.
Right.
So
Yeah.
the idea is that it captures as wide of range of lighting situations as possible.
Right.
So you could look at an image that is, and I have one, the example here I have is of a sunset. And so we're talking kind of the extreme backlit image, backlit by the sun. Um, and if you go with the one that's a little lighter, oh, hold on, just took a screenshot by accident there. The one that's a little lighter, a little less dramatic.
Okay.
That's
Yeah.
how it came out of it there. So you can see, even though this is a sunset, because it was an HDR photo and HDR is on automatically. I don't even know if you can turn it off anymore in the iPhone.
Not in the newer ones,
The
no.
old ones you could, the newer ones you can't.
I'm
But you
gonna
can
check my
still
10s Max while you're talking there.
okay.
So
I want to say yes on the well, you could have, but with the newest version of the iOS, I don't know if they removed it. But if you look at the image, you can see that you can still see the detail of the buildings and the trees, even though there are the clouds in the background, and this is right before a storm came through, looking west at night, and right at sunset, you can see the clouds are basically acting like a reflector. But even though you're looking directly west where the sunset is, it's able to pick up all the details and the color of what's in front of you in in the shaded areas.
yeah.
Now, this is one point, normally it does a really good job, but sometimes this is where you may want to go into like a Pixelmator or like a Photomator or a Lightroom Mobile for just a different feel for it.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times with the HDR has gotten better. When I remember the first HDR apps when they weren't built in for the iPhone, and you
Yeah.
could select how many images it would take to
Yeah.
bracket the exposure. You could do 3, 5, or 7. It would do one as quote unquote normal exposure and so many on either side, and it would try to compare the images and stack them together.
Yeah. And
And the early ones had a HDR look to it.
yeah, some of
Not
them were so
not
overly
necessarily.
baked it was crazy.
Yeah, yeah. Now I would say this: if you want to have an artistic look to a photo, and unfortunately this is one weak spot, Camera Plus 2, or I guess it's 22 now, 23, whatever. I
Yeah.
know they're changing. Their HDR filter still overbakes it.
Yeah.
It looks bad, but it's one of those things of that could be a particular style someone has because
Yeah.
it has a look to it. You know, like you see certain people who put out certain paintings or pictures, and you're like, okay, that's your style. It's overblown. It's too contrasty. The colors are overdone and overpopped, but that's their style.
Yeah.
you know but yeah, the HDR has gotten so much better, but still it helps sometimes to deal with the black point, to deal with the contrast, to tweak it a little bit to make it a little less hazy, a little less a little more solid. Then a lot of times the contrast just goes down a little too much, and it's trying to fix a situation where maybe it even can't do it
Hmm.
because I took that image, cropped off the bottom bit with the houses. This is the other sunset image,
Yeah.
and changed it where I actually made dark image. I actually undid the HDR in Lightroom.
Oh yeah. Okay.
So I created a silhouette.
Yeah.
So, and that was for a particular look. So again, it does it automatically. Sometimes you want to have it where you can see, like if you're taking a picture of a crowd, you want to see the people and the background, especially if it's a light day, there's not many clouds out. HDR is great. If you're
Yeah.
looking to do a silhouette or you're looking for a little more dramatic, you may have to undo the HDR. It sounds kind of weird. You may have to undo it to get the look you're looking for.
Yeah, and the iPhone, I think I'm not sure about the 11, but I'm pretty sure the 12, 13, and 14 all have smart HDR
Yeah.
turned on, and you can't do anything with it.
Right.
I looked at my 10s Max, and actually it has a toggle for smart HDR,
Okay.
so I
Okay.
could turn it off. And if I do have it on, I could keep the normal photo as well as the HDR one.
Okay.
So, so that I wish they would bring that back. That is something that
Yeah.
they should let us have a little more control over the way the HDR works.
Yeah. And this is
But
another reason if you want to do a little more, like you said about the 90% rule. If
yeah,
you want to do the 10% that Apple doesn't engineer for, there are, like the manual apps like you talked about. Unfortunately, a
hmm
lot of the manual apps, and I know this is economics, you can't, they're subscription models now.
pretty much, yeah.
And a Lightroom Mobile used to have a camera built in. They took
Well,
that
it
out.
still does.
No, it doesn't. Well, I
There's
couldn't find it. I couldn't find it on my latest version.
there's no camera function in Lightroom Mobile.
Uh, I no, not on the latest. There's a device, Lightroom, and Discover on the bottom, and that's the only options you have.
They took the camera model out.
They kept the camera out.
What are they thinking? I don't use Lightroom Mobile that often,
Okay.
so
Yep. The latest edition got rid of the camera because that was a whole manual camera with its own H. You could do like its own version of HDR.
oh, there is a camera. Yep, there's
Okay.
a camera.
Okay. Now, can you go back to show me where you saw that at?
Okay, so if you go to edits and where it says my edits, camera buttons in the bottom right hand corner.
The thing is, if you update the app, it'll go away.
Really?
Yep. Because hold on, I'm going to this is going to be riveting
Yeah.
for everyone else. Let me unblur my background here, so maybe this will work. And let me turn my brightness all the way down. So, hold on. There's my screen when I turn it on.
Okay, so go to what do you got there? You got device,
Yep.
Lightroom, and Discover. So
Yep.
if you go to Lightroom in the middle, the
Okay.
bottom,
Oh, you're right. I see it now. I see it now.
yeah,
Okay. Yep. Okay.
that's good because it's
Well,
got
yeah.
the HDR function of that
Yeah.
particular camera is really good.
Honestly, it wouldn't shock me if they got rid of it and then said, "Well, the Lightroom Mobile's free, but if you subscribe to the
Yeah,
$99.99, blah blah blah." Yeah, so you get the automatic, you get the professional, and you get the high dynamic range where you have a lot more options for exposure, white balance, you know. And like you said, it is good, and you can do raw images on this, and this is free.
yeah,
So when we're talking about manual camera apps, if you want to play around with manual camera apps and you don't want to subscribe quite yet,
yeah,
you know,
yeah. Well, I'm
you
glad
have
they
to
didn't
sign,
take the.
nope,
Yeah, I'm
they
glad they didn't
moved
take
it.
the.
I would say this, they moved
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. I'm glad they didn't
They
totally
did move
remove
it.
it because
They did
it
move it
does
though.
have a really good HDR
Yeah.
camera in it. And I mean, I wouldn't hesitate to use it one bit if I wanted
Nope.
to, take the HDR a little further than what the smart HDR does.
Yep.
I'm going to test it. If I think of it, I'm going to test it sometime when I'm out, and I'm going to compare it to what the Apple camera does for the smart HDR, and just to see how much of a difference there is. And I'm willing to bet that the Adobe version is probably much better. So, um, so basically HDR, high dynamic range, shows the most it can without overexposing and underexposing of the dynamic range of the image, right? So, um, the way the Apple camera does it does it to make it look pretty darn good.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can get a picture of, say, a field on an overcast day, and then it'll also show you all the detail in the clouds. And You cannot get that with a traditional camera because it's
Yeah.
going to either expose for the field in the foreground or the clouds above. And if it does the field, it's going to blow out the clouds. If it does the clouds, it's going to underexpose the field type of thing. So that's where phones really do well in photography. Is you don't need special filters and things like that to do that. So, okay, so manual camera apps. This is a section of its own. We've been talking about this, probably all night here. So what it says here is to have more control over exposure, you can use third-party manual camera apps available on the App Store. These apps allow you to adjust shutter speed, ISO, and other settings manually. Popular manual camera apps for iPhone include, and I forget what ChatGPT said, but I put these in because I think these are three of the best in my opinion, in my experience. Popular manual camera apps for iPhone include Reflex, Camera M, and Pro Camera. So why would you use a third-party camera app? The ability to manually select the camera you want. That's something we haven't talked about yet tonight.
Yeah.
If you want to use attachment lenses, you almost have to use a third-party camera app because the way the iPhone does things with the cameras, it's going to want to use the main camera for most of its stuff. If you use the telephoto and it's too dark, it's going to use the main camera and do some mumbo jumbo to try to make it look like a telephoto image. That's a whole nother discussion.
Mm-hmm.
But at least with a manual or a third-party camera app, you can manually select the camera that you want, and it's going to use that camera no matter what. It also gives you more control over the camera functions. So we've been talking about that all night, with the EV slider, the ISO, the shutter speed, all that stuff. A third-party camera app will have more features than the Apple camera. The Apple camera is pretty darn good. It has a lot of features, but it just doesn't have as many as, you look at the options in a manual camera app, like a third-party app like Reflex or Camera M or Camera Plus or any of those. The features that they have are, crazy. There's a crazy amount of options compared to the Apple camera. And the last point I have about using a third-party camera app is it's going to help improve your photography because you can use these various functions and see how they change the final image. Again, we talked about that already too with the histogram and with the exposure compensation and things like that. You can improve your photography, your knowledge of photography, by getting to know what these functions are and how they work and how they change the final image. So, in different lighting conditions, you may need to do different things with your camera settings to get the image you want. So, don't hesitate one bit to use a third-party camera app. I really like Reflex because I like the way it's laid out. I like the design of the app. Everything's right there in front of you. All the functions are there's nothing hidden. Everything's right there that you need. But there's a lot of good ones out there. I know Reese Boyd, who is in a couple of the groups. He does a lot of really cool long exposure things. But one of his favorites is Camera Pixels. It's a great app. It just depends on what you like, right?
Yeah.
So, explore them and see which one suits you best. And finally, we have practice and experimentation, Dave.
And understanding exposure is best achieved, almost like everything else with photography, practice and experimentation. You can listen to us go on and give hints, but until you go out there, you take the photos in different lighting conditions, vary the settings, and observe the results. That's how you get, when people say they have intuition, it's mostly due to doing something over and over and over and over again to the point where your mind has a muscle memory to think, oh, I'm in this condition and I've done it enough to know to do this, and the picture will come out the way I want it to. but the only way you can get there is to take lots of photos. Luckily, the only cost for taking a photo is the storage space in the iCloud space.
Yeah, that's true.
Also, hashtag Apple increase the iCloud space, please.
Yes.
It's ridiculous. $3 trillion company, they should give us more space for free. But
Yeah.
um, that's that in time. And the other great thing is you can take like you said, I'll take a photo with the built-in app. Boom, I know it'll look good. It may not look great, but it'll look good. Hey,
Hmm.
I want to try this in the Lightroom camera app that you showed me where it's at. Hey, no problem. I can just keep the phone there, close down I'm doing a thing of swiping up to get rid of the camera.
Hmm.
Open up that one, start it, do whatever manual adjustments, take another photo right there. Oh, I want to try another thing. I'll take another photo there. I want to take another photo there. It helps if you have somewhere either a little notepad, or you can keep in mind what settings you have, so you can
Hmm.
look at it later and think, okay, photo A was unadjusted default camera. Photo B, C, and D were with this particular app, and here's what I use for B. Here's what I use for C. Here, oh, I can see I did this and that made this blurry, or I did this and that really fixed the lighting. And
Yeah, yeah.
oh, okay, I did this and I can do this here, and I did this, and this app does a better job than this app, even though I have the exact same settings on these two different apps. This one app's the way it does the processing, I like better than the way this app does the processing behind the scenes when it takes a photo.
Yeah,
But the
yeah.
only way you can do that is to take lots of photos.
Yeah, that's right.
And then when you're doing lots of photos, if you're like, because I know it's hard to say, is this photo I took a good photo? Most people are either they fall in love with an image, they're like, I love how this turned out. This is so great. And it may or may not have turned out great, but when you're stuck on an image, you're like, this is the image. Or you could be overly harsh, which I think
Yeah.
most people are. They're overly harsh on themselves. So it's hard to have that I trust, so show it to people. They
Yeah.
don't have to be photographers. Most people who look at photos are not photographers.
Right.
you
Yeah.
know so say, let me ask you something, that photo and that photo, which one do you like better, and can you tell me why? And most people,
Hmm.
if they're friends, spouses, after a while they get a little annoyed. Co-workers,
Yeah.
because I've gotten to be like Facebook friends with people I work with, and I'll post photos, and they're like, that was a great photo, or I like this way, or this I like because of this way type thing. So
Yeah.
it's practice, experiment, and get feedback,
Yeah. And
and
some of
have
the
a thick
best feed.
and have a thick enough skin to take the feedback, for
Oh
as long
yeah.
as it's as
Yeah.
long I should say this, as long as it's positive feedback in terms of something you can work off of, versus, oh, that doesn't look good, why? It just doesn't look good. Well, doesn't help.
And that's where the subjective things come
Yeah,
into play, right? I mean, some of the best places for good feedback is these Facebook groups that we talk about,
exactly.
and generally people won't give like a good solid critique of an image unless you ask for it.
Well, people are trying to
Um,
be, hopefully people are trying to be nice,
yeah, yeah.
and no one wants to go and say, well, that's a stupid looking, but if you're, and a lot of people, if you, like you said, if you're saying, hey, here's an image I took, I'm looking for feedback, do you
Hmm.
have any suggestions?
Yeah.
And you'll
And
get
all
some
I and
nice positive reactions.
right. And like you said though, you got to have thick skin because you got to be prepared to hear, like if I was going to give a critique on an image,
Yeah.
I'm going to be as truthful and honest as I can be about it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to leave my likes and dislikes out of it as much as I can, because I'm just going to look at it and give a critique based on the image itself, right? I mean, what's the best way to put it? I might be a little technical about it, but I mean,
Right.
I'm gonna try to, and if I say anything negative about an image, I will always end it with something positive, because I don't believe that it's healthy to give negative feedback on something without looking at the positive sides.
Mm-hmm.
So I enjoy looking at people's photography. I enjoy giving a critique, because not only do I try to help them learn, but usually I'll learn something myself out of the critique. And I don't mind getting a critique of my images. And one of these days I'll put something on. If I remember, I will say, okay, critique this thing, give it to me straight. I could take it, fire away.
Mm-hmm.
And but practice and experimentation is by far the easiest and best way to learn about the exposure and how it gets affected.
Right.
So to summarize the whole thing, ChatGPT says, remember that exposure is subjective, and there's that word again, subjective,
Mm-hmm.
and can be used creatively to achieve different effects. We kind of covered that tonight too.
Yeah.
It's important to find a balance. Oh, look at that. There's that balance that suits your artistic vision and the mood you want to convey in your iPhone photography. So I think we covered it really good here, Dave. I think we covered a lot of good, valid points, and hopefully the listeners will take something out of this and learn something from it. I mean, we learned stuff ourselves, especially with what Mike said about ISO and stuff like that. So
that's brand new.
Yeah. And I mean, very clever, a very clever observation about ISO with digital photography. And how long has digital photography been around? Decades.
Yeah.
When you think about it, and that this is the first we're hearing about this stuff. Wow. It's crazy. So anyway, on that note, just quickly, a preview for the next show is going to be exploring the iPhone camera features. So it's going to be all about the iPhone camera, no third-party apps, but there's a lot of stuff to cover there. Yeah. We're even going to delve into a little bit of night mode stuff by the looks of it. So yeah, it should be interesting. So all right, well, tell folks where they can find you, Dave.
Sure. You can find me on pretty much all the socials as Prof Pod. On TikTok, you can find me as Prof Pod PGH.
All righty. And I am Macmillan Photo on Instagram and Threads, Macmillan_photo on Twitter. And don't forget the podcast website is iPhoneography.ca. You can find the show notes there. Any images that we talk about on the podcast will be in each episode post. You can listen online right there while you're looking at the pictures. And don't forget the images are also in the podcast app on the iPhone. The images will show in Overcast and Pocket Cast and a few other different podcast players. Not to my knowledge, they still don't show up in Spotify. Come on, Spotify, get with it. I should check that maybe sometime and see if I don't use Spotify, so I don't know. But yeah, there's always a way to see what we're talking about, and I think it's a good way to illustrate our points. So check them out. And on that note, I guess we'll see everybody on the next one.
Have a great one, everyone.